वेलकम टू आवर यूट्यूब चैनल मकबूल रिएक्शन। दोस्तों कैसे हैं आप? उम्मीद करते हैं सब ठीक होंगे। दोस्तों आज हम जो वीडियो लेकर आए हैं, ये वीडियो पहला नंबर थोड़ी सी लंबी होने वाली है, आपने वीडियो हमारे साथ पूरी देखनी है। और दूसरा पॉइंट इंडिया की इकोनॉमी पर है कि इंडिया की इकोनॉमी दुनिया में सुपर पावर किस तरह बन सकती है। इंडिया में ये वो क्या बोलते हैं कि खूबी पाई जाती है कि वो अपनी इकोनॉमी को बहुत ऊपर लेकर जा सकता है। और शायद इस वीडियो में और भी बहुत से फैक्ट्स हैं और मेरे ख्याल में इस वीडियो में इंडिया की इकोनॉमी के लिहाज से बहुत कुछ बताने वाले हैं। इस वीडियो के बाद देखेंगे कि क्या कुछ इंडिया की इकोनॉमी के बारे में ये बताने वाले हैं और कितनी बड़ी इकोनॉमी होने वाली है, या कौन से इसमें नकाइस हैं जो इंडिया ने किए हैं, या कौन से इसमें वो अवामिल हैं जो इंडिया करने जा रहा है। ये पूरी वीडियो में हमारे साथ रहिएगा, बहुत मज़ा आने वाला है। शायद कई लोग जो इकोनॉमी में इंटरेस्ट नहीं रखते उनके लिए बोरिंग भी हो, लेकिन जो इंटरेस्ट रखते हैं वो कमाल का इस वीडियो में सीखेंगे। हमारे साथ पूरी वीडियो देखिएगा, देर के बगैर इस वीडियो को देखते हैं।
30 according to the IMF. As the world's largest democracy, India's future is bright. Yet its economic story has had its fair share of challenges. In 1980, its GDP per capita was higher than China's, but today China's is 5 times higher. Likewise, neighboring Bangladesh
1980 में चाइना से इनका जीडीपी ज्यादा था,
सही है।
और अब चाइना का 5% इनसे दुगना की चुगना की पुगना हो चुका है। ये क्यों चीज़ वजूहत थी ना, जिस वजह या चाइना ने ज्यादा तरक्की की है या इंडिया वालों ने कम तरक्की की है। देखते हैं इस वीडियो में।
Bangladesh reportedly overtook India on a GDP per capita basis in 2020. So, what has happened and how can India achieve economic success? How India's history informs its economy today. To understand modern India, we must first look to history, and India has a very rich one. Literally. For over 700 years, the subcontinent was estimated to have been the wealthiest place on earth, accounting for an estimated quarter of global trade up until the 18th century.
तुम्हें पता है जिस तरह आजकल पूरी दुनिया में अमेरिका और इंग्लैंड और बरतानिया को बहुत अमीर ममालिक समझा जाता है, बहुत ज़्यादा। अब से जब यहाँ पे हुकूमत थी ना बादशाहों की, जब ये हिंदुस्तान इकट्ठा था अंग्रेज़ों के दौर से पहले, जब अंग्रेज़ों ने हमला किया था, ये हमारा खित्ता दुनिया में सोने की चिड़िया समझा जाता था। मतलब कि यहाँ पे इतना ज़्यादा सोना पाया जाता था पूरी दुनिया में कहीं नहीं, और ये दुनिया का अमीर तरीन खित्ता था, ये बरे सगीर पूरा, और हमने खुद ही बर्बाद कर दिया।
ये तो है।
And then, as is often the case in history, a colonial empire turned up. In India's case, this was the British Empire. Britain wasn't the first foreign power to hold sway over the continent, but its economic impact was profound over nearly 200 years of colonial rule. For starters, Britain's interests were principally economic. It's estimated that in today's money, the British Empire extracted a whopping $45 trillion from India. The infrastructure built and the institutional legacy were geared towards the efficient extraction of one thing: India's incredibly vast resources, which undeniably created structural problems, having a lasting impact until today. So following
सब साइकिल पे सफर कर रहे हैं यार, मजा आ रहा है ना, ट्रैफिक का नहीं है, सब तंदुरुस्ती और
independence in 1947, India spent decades trying to survive with limited international trade, on the belief that the size of its internal market and the idea that self-reliance would avoid the international exploitation which can come with capitalism. As a result, India was transformed into a mainly centrally planned economy, where the centralized institutions of British India were easily adapted to this new command structure. Yet, as history has revealed time and time again, a top-down model of state-controlled economic growth was unsustainable, especially for such a diverse nation such as India. So by the 1980s, the country started to really open up its businesses to drive certain sectors. But, and there is a big but here, the state continued to manage capital flows, including its exchange rate. You see,
1980 के बाद इन्होंने अपना बिजनेस ज़्यादा डेवलप किया और पैसा झोंपा और बाहर की दुनिया के साथ ज़्यादा बिजनेस शुरू किया, और उसके बाद इन्होंने तरक्की करना शुरू की। अब भी इंडिया की जीडीपी हमारी निस्बत तो बहुत ही ज़्यादा है ना, बहुत ज़्यादा।
ये तो है।
वो तो चाइना टेक्नोलॉजी में बहुत आगे निकल गया।
यहाँ से आगे निकल गया, इसलिए काम हो गया।
India had until that point always fixed its currency, the rupee, to others, initially to the British pound and then to a basket of currencies. The problem was that by 1990, continual state intervention was bankrupting the country. The final push came with the collapse of the Soviet Union, a main export market, alongside increases in the price of oil during the First Gulf War, at which point India's pegged exchange rate had exhausted the central bank's reserves to intervene in the currency markets. This forced India to seek IMF assistance, and unsurprisingly, these bailouts came with conditions of trade liberalization.
ये जो IMF में जो भी ममालिक जाते हैं ना, वो अपनी आवाम को इतना गुर्बत में डाल देते हैं कि IMF अपनी शराइत देता है, हुकूमतों को उनके मुताबिक चलना पड़ता है और पता नहीं क्या कुछ करवा देते हैं, गुलाम ही बन जाते हैं। भाई आवाम को जिस चीज़ में रिलीफ देना हो IMF रोक देता है, ये काम नहीं करना, वो नहीं करना, इस तरीके से चलो, फिर उनकी माननी पड़ती है। फिर आवाम को नहीं पता होता कि क्या क्यों महंगाई हो रही, क्योंकि वो हुकूमतों की मजबूरी बन जाती है, कर्जा उठाया होता है। वो बता रहे हैं ना कि इंडिया में इकोनॉमी बैंक करप्ट हो गई थी, जिस वजह से वो IMF के पास गए, जाना पड़ा, मजबूरी थी। इतने बड़े मुल्क को चलाना भी हिम्मत है यार।
And free market reforms, with the currency becoming more free-floating but still subject to intervention by the Bank of India and restrictions. Importantly, it was these liberal reforms which have led to the Indian economy we see today, a mixed economy of private and public sectors, where certain sectors such as banking and power still largely operate under government monopoly, which shouldn't come as too much of a surprise given the history of state intervention, though the impact of opening up to trade shouldn't be understated. Why India's exports have been a quiet success. When most people think of India, they don't consider the nation to be an exporting powerhouse, particularly when it comes to manufacturing. India has struggled with protectionism, recording the highest tariffs of any major economy. Yet one phrase often quoted is that if China was the world's factory, India was getting ready to be its back office, highlighting the nation's stellar service sector exports, particularly in IT. But in reality, the nation's manufacturing sector has grown on average by 12% per year between 1995 and 2000.
इसी सेक्टर में तो चाइना बहुत आगे निकल गया और इंडिया पीछे रह गया। मतलब बाकी कारोबार में तो इंडिया बहुत आगे था, और वो बता रहे थे कि चीज़ों की प्रोटेक्शन करने में पीछे रह गया। चीज़ भिजवाने का जो प्रोसेस था ना, उसको महफूज करके किस तरह बैनुल अक़वामी मियार के साथ आगे सेल किया जाए, उस लिहाज से और बहुत सी चीज़ों में पीछे रह गए, जिस वजह से चाइना आगे चला गया। और टेक्नोलॉजी में तो चाइना था ही आगे।
2018, giving it the third best performance in the world after China and Vietnam, and nearly twice the world average. Now, despite India's lingering protectionist policies, this could start to sound like India was following the same development model as the tiger economies of East Asia, one based on manufacturing. But before we get ahead of ourselves, there is a fundamental difference. India's export growth has been overwhelmingly skewed towards high-skilled manufacturing and services, as opposed to low-skilled exports in things like textiles. And this really is astounding, as virtually all models of international trade and growth would have predicted the opposite. You see, India has a very large low-skilled labour force, so on the surface, its comparative advantage is in low-skilled exports. This makes its high-skilled specialisation a bit, well, unique. One answer often floated for this is India's large, English-speaking, educated population. But any explanation misses a fundamental.
इंडिया वाले लोग ज़्यादातर ब्लैक कलर में ज़्यादातर
ये हमारे पूरे खित्ते का रंग है भाई।
नहीं, हमारे पाकिस्तानी में ना काफ़ी
ज़्यादा चेंज है। नहीं, वो इंडिया का मैं बताता हूँ ना, इंडिया बहुत बड़ा है। हमारे पास है 4 सूबे हैं। हाँ। और इंडिया में जो है ना, ये तमिल और मराठा लोग मेरे ख्याल में ये थोड़े थोड़े ना गूढ़ा ब्राउनिश कलर के हैं। और हमारी तरफ पंजाबी भी, उधर भी वाइट होते हैं भाई। सिखों को देखो,
नहीं ज़्यादातर मैं बोल
वाइट होते हैं ना। हम इधर पंजाब है, हमारा मुल्क छोटा सा है। पठान वैसे ही वाइट होते हैं, वो खैबर पख्तूनख्वा का है, बलोची भी वाइट होते हैं। हर नस्ल का एक कलर होता है, वो सारे इस तरह के नहीं हैं। उधर के बहुत बड़ा मुल्क है, हमारे तो 10 हो तो वो एक बनता है।
point that by underserving low-skilled manufacturing, the nation is estimated to be missing out on at least $140 billion of unskilled activity per year. And remember, this is in a country where over 90% of the labour force operates in the informal sector, so the stability, formal employment, security, and not to mention pensions, which come with any increase in formalised manufacturing, is certainly required. However, India's unbalanced export growth is more than just a missed opportunity. It can present a real challenge to future growth. Why India's over-reliance on skilled exports could lead to slower growth. Firstly, let's be clear here. India's excellent skilled service sector is a good thing. It showcases the country's ability to compete in a highly productive and not to mention lucrative space. But the over-reliance on the sector is a huge risk, one which can be summed up in economic terms by the Lewis curve. The Lewis curve highlights the process of structural transformation in any economy through the redeployment of resources, particularly people, from low productivity to high productivity jobs. The classic example of this is actually China, which experienced the transfer of labor en masse from low productive, low wage agriculture to high
अच्छा
productive.
हर चीज में ना ये चाइना के साथ कंपैरिजन कर रहा है
मैं
इसका।
सोच रहा ना वो चाइना
तो देखो चाइना के साथ कंपैरिजन होना भी बहुत बड़ी बात है। चाइना पता नहीं कितनी बड़ी इकोनॉमी है यार, अभी तो वो सुपर पावर बनने जा रहा है दुनिया का, अमेरिका को पीछे छोड़ने वाला है। और इकोनॉमी का उसके साथ मवाजन होना, वो भी इंटरनेशनल मीडिया की जानिब से, ये इंडियन चैनल नहीं है।
अच्छा,
और बहुत बड़ी बात है, को मायने रखता है ये।
Higher paying manufacturing. In India's case, we need to look at two of its Lewis curves, one for high-skilled tech and the other for low-skilled manufacturing. Over the last 2 decades, it has rapidly climbed the high-skilled tech curve, to the point where skilled labour is harder to come by, as reflected through
ये
reported
चीज़ जो
difficulty.
है ना, हम मार खा जाते हैं दोनों ममालिक इंडिया और पाकिस्तान। ये जो स्किल्ड लेबर नहीं है, मतलब कि मजदूर तो हमारे पास बहुत है, लेकिन वो एक्सपीरियंस वाले नहीं है, वो काम को समझते नहीं है। किसी भी फील्ड में जाए ना, उनको सिखाना पड़ता है, पहले उनको सिखा के अपना काम बिगड़वाएं, उसके बाद वो करते हैं। स्किल्ड लेबर जो होती है ना, वो बड़ा मायने रखती है। जो भी पाकिस्तानी है, इंडियन है, वो दुबई में काम कर रही है, अपने मुल्क में आके काम नहीं करते ये लोग।
In labour supply and subsequently higher wages. On the other hand, India has barely climbed its lower skilled manufacturing curve, as demonstrated by India's exports, 2/3 of which is skilled based, and only increasing in size over the last 20 years. The problem here though is that the nation's engine for growth has been driven by high skilled exports, which may be unsustainable in the face of scarce skilled labour and higher wages. Critics have suggested that India's inability to follow the likes of Vietnam or China in growing its low-skilled manufacturing base is an issue, but at the same time offers an avenue for future growth. And this opportunity shouldn't be overlooked, especially as China transitions away from the sector, alongside a decline in its workforce by 30 million over the next decade. Now, when discussing India, comparisons over whether it's going to follow China's growth model are often made. But when China was at a similar stage of development as India is now, it was growing much, much faster. So, why hasn't India grown as fast as China did? Well, if we put aside the capitalizing on its comparative advantage in low-skilled labor, China has had a much higher rate of gross domestic investment, estimated to be about 70% more than India, alongside 6 times more patent applications filed by foreigners, which is an excellent economic indicator of wider economic traits like innovation, infrastructure, and business climate. Not only has China's investment rate been higher, but its difference in interest rates between borrowings and savings, otherwise known as its spread, has been lower, and this enables money to circulate more efficiently in the system. This financial advantage goes beyond interest rate spreads though, with Chinese banks having extended credit at 2.5 times that in India. Corporate tax rates are also lower in China, as well as how the government moves money around, with China moving proportionally more tax revenues to underdeveloped regions. To put this in context, China transfers over 50% of tax revenues, whilst India transfers just over 1/3. Yet, things aren't all bad for India. One of India's greatest advantages is its young population, which is already acting as a demographic dividend. India will overtake China's population by 2027, and its population is set to continue to grow.
चाइना को इंडिया 2027 में पॉपुलेशन के लिहाज से क्रॉस कर जाएगा।
चाइना,
हाँ, इंडिया चाइना को अभी दुनिया में सबसे ज़्यादा पॉपुलेशन चाइना की है, लेकिन इंडिया 2027 तक पॉपुलेशन में भी झंडे गाड़ देगा।
Over the next 30 years, whilst China's declines. This will provide a huge boost to domestic demand, with an estimated 500 million people expected to enter the middle income class over the next decade, which will provide India with the largest growth in its middle class anywhere in the world. This isn't to mention that although China has been built on infrastructure, investment and manufacturing, India is only just getting started on these three pivotal factors. The population is still largely a rural one, with only a third of the country living in cities. This is surprising considering there are over 300 cities with more than 1 million people. As any economist will tell you, cities tend to be more productive places than isolated, poorly connected, rural areas where opportunities are often limited. But just as startling is where the growth of urban areas is coming from. Contrary to popular belief, most of it isn't from farm to urban.
इकोनॉमी की तो बात जारी है, हम सुन रहे हैं, लेकिन ये जो मैं इंडिया की जगह देख रहा हूँ ना, अजीब सी एक फीलिंग आ रही जैसे हमारा अपना घर ही है ना, कोई फर्क नहीं है, कोई माहौल अपने जैसा ही है, सब कुछ
वैसा ही निजाम है जैसे हमारा है.
Migration, but due to natural growth. This helps to explain India's persistently large non-urban population, with a staggering 40% of its labour force still employed in agriculture. As highlighted before in other countries, urban migration comes with a host of challenges like rampant poverty and inequality. The persistence of poor infrastructure and inadequate housing is a real problem, which just goes to highlight how moving to an urban area is not the perfect economic solution. Now, even before 2020, India's growth had shown signs of stumbling, which is not something you'd expect from a superpower on the rise. So, what about India's slowing economy? This came as a bit of a shock to many commentators, as India went from possessing the title of fastest growing major economy to reporting 5% growth in 2019, its lowest in a decade. This is still an impressive number, but not if India wants to hit its target of becoming a $5 trillion economy by 2025, which, by the way, would require an almost doubling of this growth rate. Now, there are just as many explanations for why India's economy slowed as there are economic commentators, but a few have been highlighted more than others. One is that there's been a more bleak global economic climate, particularly in the light of rising protectionism. Another was a slowdown in consumer demand, which is worth digging into a bit deeper. Slowing consumption in India was seen in part through a decline in new bank lending. As banks face rising non-performing loans, investment fell as market confidence declined and the unemployment rate rose. So, what has India been doing to propel its economy? To be fair to the government, it has been trying to attract new manufacturing for years, launching its flagship Make in India campaign back in 2014. Though, as alluded to earlier, over 90% of the country's workforce operates in the informal sector, which is a huge problem when providing social security, collecting taxes and regulation, especially considering the tens of millions of day labourers who rely on inconsistent wages. Their vulnerability became a real problem when the economy shut down in 2020 and is a core reason as to why India's economy was hit almost twice as hard as the world average. This hasn't gone unnoticed by the Indian government. To help address this, labour laws have been streamlined, replacing 44 labour codes.
ये मेरे ख्याल में आप वो रीजन बता रहे हैं जो इंडिया को ठीक करने चाहिए, ये इंडिया करने वाला है। लॉज बनाए जा रहे हैं, जिस तरह ये लेबर लॉ है कि मजदूरों के लिए कवानीन, मजदूरों को कितना पैसा देगा, उनकी कितनी तरबियत होनी चाहिए, कैसा होना चाहिए, ये सब कुछ जो एक कवानीन ना बनाए जाए ना, तो बिजनेस आगे नहीं बढ़ सकता, क्योंकि हमारी स्किल्ड लेबर इधर कितनी है तुम जानते हो.
Before laws in an attempt to reduce red tape. As you can also imagine though, such a large informal sector doesn't make tax collection an easy task. The best example of India trying to address its chronic tax evasion issues is the now infamous demonetization of 2016, when an unbelievable 86% of the country's entire physical cash base became illegal tender overnight, done in order to catch tax evaders as they rushed to cash in their old notes. The short-term shock of this was undeniable, causing an economic slowdown. Yet, as mentioned earlier, government barriers, particularly when it comes to trade, are still a fundamental issue. A recent example was India withdrawing from an Asian-based free trade agreement called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which covers over 2 billion people in 14 Asian countries, who account for over 30% of global GDP. The government had concerns over the lack of protection for manufacturing and a large absence in the free trade agreement of the service sector, which, as highlighted, is India's key export strength. But whether India can claim its place as an economic superpower after becoming the most populous country on earth will, just like other countries, depend on its ability to trade competitively, address its bureaucracy, and formalize its largely informal economy. So overall, India's growing economy has had its fair share of challenges. For decades, a closed economy, the nation has seen rapid growth in its high-skilled exports, though the sustainability of this as a source of growth has come under question. This has underpinned India's non-traditional development to date, highlighting its underrepresented low-skilled manufacturing base. And this is something which is likely to become a growing opportunity as the world decouples from China's supply chain, and China itself seeks to rebrand its economy towards services. Trade has been given as a key reason for India's stellar growth over recent years. Yet, the country has the highest tariffs of any major economy. Whilst comparisons of India to China are common, the countries are inherently different. India is still predominantly a non-urban based society, yet to capitalise on this potential. But things are changing. Demographics are on its side, with a middle class set to grow by over 500 million over the next decade, propelling its economy forward. However, the nation's slowing growth, even before 2020, was a cause for concern. How India manages its development over the next decade will be crucial to whether it achieves economic superpower status sooner rather than later. So now it's over to you. Do you think India will overcome its reliance on high-skilled exports in the years to come? Or does it really matter? Is India on track to become an economic superpower? Let us know in the comments below. The AltSimplified team really enjoyed making this video, so if you think we've earned it, leave us a like and consider subscribing. It really helps grow this channel.
अच्छा, वीडियो तो खासी लंबी थी, लेकिन डिटेल में उसने बताया कि इंडिया कहाँ तक पहुँच सकता था और कितना पीछे रह गया किन वजूहात की वजह से, और कौन सी वजूहात पर अगर वो अभी भी काबू पा ले तो इंडिया कहाँ जा सकता है। ये तो हम जानते हैं कि इंडिया का जीडीपी इंतहाई ज़्यादा है हमारी निस्बत, पाकिस्तान की निस्बत, और वहाँ पर पैसा भी बहुत और बिजनेसमैन भी बहुत बड़े बड़े हैं, पैसा लगाने वाले भी बहुत हैं। वो बता रहा है 80 की दहाई तक इंडिया का जीडीपी चाइना से बहुत ज़्यादा था, लेकिन एक चीज़ मुझे समझ नहीं है, वो ये भी बता रहा है कि 80 के बाद चाइना ऊपर जाना शुरू हुआ, लेकिन उसने साथ ये बात भी बताई है कि इंडिया ने 80 के बाद अपने बिजनेस पर पैसा भी ज़्यादा लगाया। ये क्या साइंस थी? इसके बाद दूसरा वो बता रहा था कि हमारी लेबर के बारे में हम पहले भी बात कर चुके हैं कि लेबर हमारी किस तरह की होती है। गरीब बंदा उठ के ना कोई सीखा हुआ, बस वो बोलता है कि हमें दिहाड़ी मजदूरी मिल जाए। चाइना अपनी लेबर की वजह से इतना ऊपर पहुंचा है। उन्होंने अपने लोगों पर इन्वेस्टमेंट की, अपने लोगों को सिखाया, फिर उन्हीं लोगों ने अपने मुल्क को इतना मेहनत करके ऊपर लेके गए। चाहे इंडिया की वो बता रहा है कि टेक्नोलॉजी थी, लेकिन उसको टेक्नोलॉजी को चलाने के लिए जो लोग दरकार थे उनमें इतना इल्म नहीं था, और फिर प्रोसेसिंग सिस्टम चाइना की निस्बत दुनिया की निस्बत कम थे। वो इसलिए मवाजना चाइना के साथ शायद कर रहा है कि चाइना और हम पड़ोसी हैं, और पड़ोसी नीचे से ऊपर जाता है, और ये सब कुछ इस वीडियो में बड़ा डिटेल में उसमें बताया। खासकर हाँ, जो हमने जगह देखी है वो भी बड़ी ज़बरदस्त थी। ऐसे ही लग रहा था हमारा अपना माहौल है।
माहौल है, ऐसे फील हो रहा था जैसे मतलब कि आस पास के।
अब जो मेरे ख्याल में मोदी की हुकूमत, जो कोई और हुकूमत आगे आएगी, जो भी था ये कवानीन बन रहे हैं इन पर अमल तो करे ना, जैसे लॉज बनाया जाए। इंडिया की जीडीपी
मतलब
बहुत ऊपर जा सकती
इतनी ज्यादा आबादी है ना, आबादी को यूज करे ना,
यूज करें। और खासकर ये बात भी तो है ना कि जितना पैसा हम लोग हथियारों पर लगा देते हैं, अगर लोगों पे लगाएं तो
लगाया जाए, प्रोजेक्ट्स
पर लगाएं तो कितना जा सकता है। बहुत अच्छी वीडियो थी, बहुत मज़ा आया देखने का। उम्मीद करते हैं आज की वीडियो आपको अच्छी लगी होगी। प्लीज़ हमारी इस वीडियो को लाइक करें, सब्सक्राइब करें चैनल को, अपना ख्याल रखें। अल्लाह हाफिज़, बाय बाय।